Thank you very much. It's great to be back in Chicago, one of my favourite cities. Right. Now, today, I don't want to give you just a straight overview of my new book. I want instead to give you a kind of taste of the things that I do in it. And I suppose I should say now, whether you're one of those people that we realise now think about the Roman Empire 3 times a day, or whether you're not, I'm inviting you all to dinner with the Roman Emperor. Happily, the first slide is a very dark one, so you don't need it. And you'll see why it's very dark in a minute, because I'm going to start by asking you to imagine that it's 89 CE, and you're a rather upmarket Roman bloke who's been invited by the Roman Emperor Domitian to dinner. It's all very exciting. But when you show up, things take a weird turn. Now, this is where you would have a blank black slide, so just imagine that, all right? Because the dining room into which you go is all painted black. The food is all in black dishes. The couches are black. And next to each couch, there is a silver tablet with the guest's name on, but the tablet is shaped like a tombstone. Everything is served by naked slaves who have been painted black. Aha! We can now have the fangs, we can now have the blacks. Oh, no, whoops. We've got the black slide, right? Okay. And the emperor himself, what does he do? Well, he talks only about death all evening. You obviously fear that you're not going to get out alive. But at the end of the dinner, Domitian affably waves you goodbye and you're off home. Then there's a knock at the door. Now, you really do think your last hour has come. But when you go outside, you don't find a hit squad like you're expecting. You find a group of palace porters who are carrying the silver tablets, the other decorations of the dinner, plus the slave who had been serving you, all as a present from the generous emperor. Now, what strikes me about this story, and I think will strike most of us, it's told true or not by the Roman historian Cassius Dio, what strikes me most is the uncomfortable, to say the least, commodification of the slaves. I think there's no bleaker glimpse into the position of the enslaved in Roman society than the idea that they can just be handed over as presents from the emperor to his guests, a kind of ancient equivalent of a sort of party bag. But for Dio, that wasn't the point of the story. It was to show you that you didn't need bloodshed to cause terror, and that the dinner was a prime opportunity for the emperor to scare his guests witless. The bottom line is that the Imperial banquet was where power was on display and where the emperor and his guests were seen, judged, and potentially humiliated. According to one Roman writer, the Emperor Caligula is supposed to have made fun of some rather posh Roman senators who'd come to dinner by making them act as the waiters, hitching up their togas so as to reveal an embarrassingly large quantity of bare leg. Tiberius, on the other hand, found himself ridiculed for penny-pinching meanness. His crime was that he had served up at one dinner leftovers from the dinner the previous day, right? And we might think that's very sensible, kind of decently prudent saving, but no, it was an example of disregard for the guest, really. And other things could go even worse wrong. Elagabalus, an emperor in the 3rd century, was so over-generous in showering his dinner guests with rose petals at the end of the evening that he actually smothered them to death. This is a 19th century recreation of the scene. Sometimes, though, that might have been inadvertent, but sometimes, though, it was a question of first-degree homicide. It was at dinner that the Emperor Claudius was finished off by the poisoned mushrooms supposedly fed to him by his wife Agrippina. And it was at dinner that Nero, Claudius's successor and adopted son, finished off Claudius's biological son, Britannicus, fearing that he might be a rival for the throne. This is a famous but now very damaged painting of the scene from the early 19th century. You can see on the left, Britannicus is sprawling over dead. On the right, there is Nero, who has commanded the poisoning, doing a kind of look no hands gesture, not sure what's going on, wasn't me, mate. And in the centre, his mother Agrippina, despite her own history with the poisoned mushrooms, appears to be telling Nero off. The Imperial dinner party, in other words, was a classic crime scene. Now, at this point, I need to reassure you. I've just rattled through a load of Roman emperors' names, giving cameo appearances to one or two who still ring bells, like Claudius, largely because of Robert Graves's I, Claudius, but to others, like Elagabalus, who probably don't ring any bells at all. They don't even ring bells with most classics students. Can I just say at this point, do not worry. It's terribly easy to get the impression that if you really want to understand Roman history, you have to know exactly who all these rulers really were. And you've just got a kind of a selected rogues gallery on the screen here. The good news is you don't have to know that. To be honest, most inhabitants of the Roman Empire couldn't have told you about the career of Elagabalus any more than most of us could. Sure, the emperors weren't all identicates, but for hundreds of years, they were much more similar to each other than they were different. They did the same sort of job from the same place and with the same range of staff, and their virtues and vices were pretty consistent over the centuries. In fact, I think you probably understand more about Roman history if you just take them all together and don't worry about the individuals than if you try to separate them, right? It's not a disadvantage, in other words, if you can't tell your Marcus Aureliuses from your Antoninus Piuses, and you can see on the bottom row they look exactly the same. It might even be an advantage, right? Now, what I do in my new book is I look at the emperor from Julius Caesar, who was really the first proto-emperor and who marked the end of the sort of democracy of the Roman Republic and was assassinated in 44 BC. I start with him and I go through about 30 rulers down to the middle of the 3rd century CE. But I don't do that in chronological order, and I don't do it biographically. I do it thematically across a whole range of their activities. Where did they live? Who did they sleep with? How did they get around? What did they do in their spare time? It's an interesting one. What their working routine was. What kind of letters did they write? And so on. And today, I'm taking one of those themes to explore with you, which is where, what, and how did the emperor eat? Who prepared the food and who cleaned up? And what does it say about Roman power? Right? First, where did they eat? Now, the basic principles of Roman dining are well known from the movies. Here's Sian Phillips. I don't know. This shows my age. This is the BBC and also shown in the US. I, Claudius from the 1970s, captures it brilliantly. We know that sort of connotes Romans, upmarket Romans at dinner. And you can see the basic principles of this, actually clearly on display, even if on a small scale, much smaller than the Imperial dinner party, in the remains of Pompeii. And you have one example here. This is a rather nice outdoor dining room. It has 3 couches in a sort of U shape, a square U shape, each holding 3 people. You can see that it was originally richly painted and it had a canopy over the top. What you might not immediately spot is that it also incorporated a water feature. The space in the middle between the couches was originally a pool in which the guests could see themselves reflected. And that little shrine at the back was actually where water cascaded down into the pool. And I want you to remember that arrangement because we're going to see it again. Because emperors' dining rooms, in their many different residences, followed those basic principles, though on a grander scale. And in sometimes, I have to say, much weirder settings. Now, this rather sad ruin is part of the main Roman palace on the Palatine Hill in Rome. And the room we're looking at here are the rather sad remains of where one poet had dinner with the emperor. It was Domitian again, though not this time a black dinner, in the late 1st century CE. And the poet hypes it in an over-the-top poem. There were, he says, 1,000 tables set out. Must have been, I think, a bit of a squash, if that's the case. And he felt he was reclining to eat with the god Jupiter, that's the emperor, among the stars. It was like being in heaven. Now, it's quite hard to reconstruct the feeling of being in heaven from what you see on the screen, but actually something smaller and more exquisite is actually buried in the foundations underneath this dining room. And it's a dining room built a little bit earlier by Nero, but one that was very soon destroyed in the Great Fire of Rome in 64. Now, it too is quite hard to imagine now, quite hard to reconstruct. So I'm giving you first a modern reconstruction of it. You can sometimes still visit this now. That's what's amazing about these dining rooms. You can actually lie down where Nero lay down. They very helpfully give you virtual reality spectacles when you visit now to try and recreate the atmosphere. But I think it's not difficult to see what's going on. If you look at the slide on the image on the left, you've got a canopy, a rather grander canopy than what we saw at Pompeii, supported on rather grander coloured marble columns. You've got another U-shaped set of couches on which the guests would have reclined. And they would have been looking across. And if you look on the slide, I'm going to point it out here. The guests from that canopy would have been looking across at this thin stage platform. They would be watching performances while they ate by all kinds of performers. So I think the key thing is that this is very much an upmarket version of the Pompeii example. And actually, although it's a bit murky, there is a pool between the diners, just like there was at Pompeii. And if you look back now to what actually survives, what you see is the actual rather flimsy remains of that little stage platform. But above it, just like at Pompeii, is like an opening from where the water cascaded down and then was taken through by a series of channels to end up in the pool between the diners. And I think if there's one thing we all need to get our heads round about upmarket Roman imperial eating, is that if they possibly could, they always ate to the sight and the sound of running water, right? And we'll see more of that. We're only just getting this point, I think, when this dining room was first excavated. There was so much water and so many pipes that the excavators thought it must be a bath building, but it wasn't. It was a dining room. And here is just to give you some idea of the decoration that was found that's no longer in situ. I think that although the writing rather covers them, the little marble, tiny little marble figures set into the wall are some of the cutest bits of Roman art ever to survive. But that's the basic principle. But Roman imperial dining can be loads weirder than that. There's always been a mystery about a later dining room built by Nero, which, according to Roman writers, constantly rotated day and night, just like the heavens. Even more mysteriously, Caligula was said to have turned a tree into a dining room, and he called it his nest, right? And he hosted banquets also on floating hotels, really, on Lake Nemi, which is now about an hour's drive from Rome. Now, we can't identify the tree, but the floating hotels were discovered just before the Second World War on the bottom of Lake Nemi. And here you see the remains of one of them with a lot of eager Italian tourists wanting to see them. These now you can't visit because they were destroyed by somebody in the Second World War. It's not quite sure by whom, whether it was the Allies or the enemy. Here, though, and there are kind of surprising twists in this story. Here, though, is a piece of mosaic which came from those floating hotels at Nemi, which actually turned up a few years ago in New York City, having been repurposed as a coffee table, right? It's now back in Italy. The people who used it as a coffee table were perfectly innocent. They were not antiquities smugglers. And there are all kinds of other ingenious locations that you find. Domitian used the Colosseum to entertain thousands of people to a meal. They must have sat on the seats, I think, rather than reclining anywhere. And they didn't watch gladiators, but sort of almost as bad. They watched staged fights in the arena while they ate between women and dwarfs, right? And one description claims that fruit was scattered over the guests from nets fixed high above them, which was, it was said, a very impressive stunt. But as some of the fruit wasn't entirely ripe, some of the guests got a nasty bump, right, as it came down. Now, you'll see also, if you compare Elagabalus and the rose petals, that another feature of the most upmarket Roman dining in the imperial palace, or sponsored by the emperor, is showering the guests with things from on high, right? But my favourite imperial dining room, though, is another variant on the water theme. It's one of the imperial family's villas on the seaside south of Rome at modern Spur Longa. And again, you can still visit this. The idea was that the guests dined on that little artificial island in the sea. That's a little artificial island. And they had their food floated across to them in miniature boats, right? And they faced, this is eye-watering Roman luxury, right? They faced into a huge natural cave. That's the view from inside it. And it was originally decorated with huge groups of sculpture, which they looked at, depicting scenes from the poetry of Homer. And that's an attempted reconstruction. I'll be coming back to this at the very end. So what did they eat, at least at big dinner parties? I'm sure that even Roman emperors just had a snack occasionally, But the image we get in Roman writers is one of display cookery. Now, it's a feature of haute cuisine throughout history, really, to combine ingredients that are hard to source and ruinously expensive, often mixing them up to make it impossible to recognise what they are, right? Now, Romans are no exception to that. The signature dish of the Emperor Vitellius, for example, supposedly contained pike livers, pheasant and peacock brains, plus flamingo tongues and lamprey innards, all mushed up so you could never tell what it was that you were eating. What I wonder, though, is in quite what form any of this was actually served up at table. Just go back to the dining arrangements here at Spurlonger. If you're one of the guests, you will be reclining, supporting yourself on one arm, so you've only really got one hand free, and you haven't got a fork because forks haven't really been invented yet. And all the food is being floated across to you on little boats, right? Now, it seems to me that there may well have been these great display dishes processed around to start with. But if so, when it comes to the point of consumption, I think they must have been cut up into bite-sized chunks, really. It must have been more finger food that the guests could have picked out with their one free hand. So if you want to envisage an imperial banquet, I think you probably have to envisage it more like tapas than meat and two veg, right? Now, that's where most Roman movies, modern Roman movies, get it very wrong, I think. And all this, of course, required a lot of staff, both front of house and in the kitchens. The vast majority of those would have been slaves or freed slaves. And we know much more about the staff who made this food than you might imagine, largely because so many of their tombstones have survived, telling us at least what their names were and what they did. Here is a man called Paris, who was a ministrator. He was a waiter of the Emperor Domitian. But there are loads of others. There's cooks, there's table napkin superintendents, there's men and women in charge of their glasses, plus, because remember that little stage in Nero's dining room, there are all kinds of dinner-time entertainers. I mean, comics, stand-ups, and there's one man, a slave, whose epitaph tells us that he was a comic impersonator and he was the first entertainer in the imperial palace to discover how to imitate barristers, right? God knows what the act was like. Another group of these entertainers actually were called coprii, which I'm afraid literally means little shits, who rushed around between the couches playing pranks, Right, now we're beginning to get a slightly different idea of the imperial dinner party, I hope. But let me just briefly show you a couple of my real favourite backstage people. This guy here was one of the most important characters at an imperial dinner. He's a former slave of the emperor. That's what aug lib, libertus Augusti, means. And he was one of the emperor's food tasters. And he was not tasting for quality. He was tasting for poison, right? We have no idea how this man actually died. We don't know whether it was on the job or not, right? Perhaps not, because his family go to the great trouble to say that he's not just a food taster, a praegustator, he's actually the manager of the food tasters. He's the head food taster, the procurator. And another little favourite is this man here, who is a palace cook and also a former slave. But likewise, he's not just any old cook. At the bottom of the slide, I've blown it up to give you the title that his family chose to give him in death, which is immensely pretentious Greek title, Archimageros. He's not just a cockos, right, any old cook. He's an Archimageros. I suppose you kind of conjure up something like chef de cuisine, something French, right? And he's no doubt in charge of some of the elaborate concoctions. It's not so easy, though, to know exactly where these people worked. There isn't a single imperial palace where we can identify a large kitchen. So where the cooking happened is a puzzle. One wonders if it was a lot of takeout. I think that might possibly be the case. But we do get just one glimpse into not an emperor's, but a would-be emperor's kitchen. It's the palace of Mark Antony and Cleopatra in Egypt, in Alexandria. Mark Antony, the rival for the throne. And one Roman historian remembers how his own grandfather had a friend who had visited the kitchens in this palace, where they must have had them, and he claimed he saw 8 wild boar roasting. Gosh, he said, you must be expecting an awful lot of people to dinner. No, said the cook, only 12, but we don't know exactly when they're going to want to sit down to eat. So we put boars to roast at different intervals to make sure that one will be perfectly done when they start, right? Now, in the UK, there's a very similar story told about the then Prince Charles, firmly denied by Buckingham Palace. It claimed that he had 7 boiled eggs cooked for him each morning, so that one would be sure to be done just like he liked it, right? So I think here we're on the cusp of the practicalities of royal dining and the myths of royal luxury, then and now. But I want to spend my last 10 minutes thinking about the ideology of power on display at these dinners and the culture of suspicion that I highlighted earlier. Now, I don't want to be too macabre about this. Most rich Romans would have been delighted to be invited to dinner at the palace. But communal eating is always about power. Who sits where, what kind of food and drink we each get. Now, I have to confess that on high table, inverted commas, at my Cambridge college, I usually get better food and drink than the students. And that's the point, right? Okay. It was like that in Rome too. Some Roman emperors were even said to have served fake food to the most inferior guests, who would then sit and watch their betters actually eating. But the display element of Roman imperial dinners was even more extreme than in the University of Cambridge. This was one of the places where the emperor was judged beyond what he served on the menu, or microaggressions of reducing senators to waiters. One emperor in the 3rd century got it spot on when he said that he felt he was on stage when he was at dinner. Many anecdotes, true or not, point to big debates about the emperor's behaviour focused on the banquet. How, for example, did he punish misdemeanours at table? Caligula is said to have chopped off the hands of a slave who pinched a strip of silver from a couch and then strung the hands round his neck. Claudius, by contrast, responded sensibly to one of his guests who had nicked a golden cup as a souvenir. Next time he came, the man found that he was the only one being served off plain pottery. Right? Now, sure, there's a status issue here. The enslaved are punished differently from the freeborn. But more than that, Caligula's response at dinner shows his sadism. Claudius's shows his decency. Other dining stories have a different message, sort of summing up the dystopian world of a palace where nothing is ever quite as it seems. The anecdote of Elagabalus and the rose petals is not just a story of a capricious teenager on the throne, though that is what he was. It points to the chilling idea that when the emperor is being most generous, he's also his most dangerous. He kills with kindness, right? Can't resist telling you at this point that Elagabalus is also supposed to be the inventor of the whoopee cushion. He had people round to dinner and he would sit them on inflatable cushions and he would have the air taken out during the dinner so that they ended up ha-ha on the floor. Another, I think, very uncomfortable anecdote for us is told about Commodus, who pushed one convention of the banquet to awful extremes. Now, as I've said, Roman imperial banquets often featured dwarfs, perhaps like the little shits, who acted up and played jokes. Commodus is supposed to have put a pair of these little people on show on a silver platter, smeared them with mustard, as if they were not just entertainers, but sort of almost ready to be consumed. Now, the anecdote is told to prove Commodus's monstrosity, but it's a reminder of the complex symbolism of the menu, which runs from real people to fake food. And as I said, the banquet was occasionally literally a place of death. Yeah. But even when murder was not actually on the menu, the emperor's dinner party was a magnifying lens onto the culture of suspicion that ruled in the imperial court, where, like in the courts of most autocrats, everyone was always looking at how everybody else behaved, who was in and who was out. The palace was a backstabbing place, never more backstabbing than at dinner. And you can see that backstabbingness in the constant presence of these food tasters checking for poison. They're both a sensible precaution and simultaneously a reminder to everyone at dinner that there might be danger in what they were eating. There's a chilling story, for example, of the Emperor Tiberius and one of his female relatives with whom he was on quite bad terms. Nonetheless, he invited her to dinner and offered her a bowl of fruit, asking her to pick a piece out. She reached out to pick an apple and then, for a nanosecond, hesitated, suddenly thinking it might have been doctored, but there was nothing that she could do, so she ate it, and it was fine. But Tiberius noticed the hesitation and inferred her suspicion, and she was soon in exile and then dead. But to finish, I was really struck when I was writing the book by how often the emperors or their designers actually built a nightmare vision of the banquet into the very decoration of their dining rooms. And I'm taking us back to Sperlonger to ask what exactly was the sculpture the guests were looking at in the cave. Well, the focal group was this. It's a huge depiction in marble of a scene from Homer's Odyssey, which many of you will know. Odysseus and his crew, fleeing from the destruction of Troy, fetch up on the island of the one-eyed giant Polyphemus. And they are entertained by him in his cave, which is where he lives. The problem is that Polyphemus is a cannibal, and the menu turns out to include a couple of Odysseus's crew. To escape, Odysseus gets the giant drunk and tells his men to drive a hot stake into the giant's eye and to blind him. And that's what's going on here. It is the mythical dinner party from hell, in which the host eats the guests and the guests blind and maim the host. What an extraordinary accompaniment to the violence and suspicion of the imperial dinner. OK, you might say, but isn't it here a joke on the cave? Isn't the joke the fact that the artists are putting a story about a cave, Polyphemus's cave, into a real cave? In part, yes, but it's more than that. There are no fewer than 4 surviving imperial dining rooms in Italy that feature, as their sculptural decoration, the scene of Odysseus and Polyphemus. And the others aren't caves, right? For me, this is a clear proof that Roman imperial designers really did see the ambivalences of these banquets, as did the guests who were reclining and looking at the design. To push that a bit further, I think you might say that dining with the emperor really was a bit like dining with Polyphemus. A nasty thought. Thank you.
Thank you all for that. Now we'll open the floor for a talk back. I'm back here on your left side. Me and Miranda. I am Devante. That is Miranda on the right side. We will be going around with these mics. Please raise your hand and speak clearly into the microphone when we give it to you. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, thank you.
Hi.
What a fascinating presentation. You told us a lot about Roman aristocrats and how they dined, and I'm wondering if there's a Roman equivalent of pizza, like something that just everybody ate.
Most of it, sadly, they didn't eat pizza. There was a claim quite recently that a painting in Pompeii actually showed a pizza, right? Actually, it showed a bit of bread with stuff on top. But the Romans didn't have pizza, but most people did eat, not lying down, right? That is formal dining. It's kind of Buckingham Palace, White House style, posh dining. Most Romans would have ate at stand-up fast food joints, sitting down, having a glass of wine, quick bit of nasty soup probably, and they would have ate on the go. I mean, I think one thing that's quite interesting about Rome is that in a society in which the poorest have very limited cooking facilities at home, you find that outside dining is what the poor have to do, right? Because the rich dine in their dining rooms at home, wherever the food's cooked, just like that one at Pompeii. It's rather upmarket within Pompeii. And they're dining, but it is dinner jacket style dining, tuxedo style dining. It's not, we tend to kind of imagine that everybody in Rome, when it came to lunchtime, would go and lie down somewhere. Well, they wouldn't. They really wouldn't. So, you're absolutely, we're at the very, very top of Roman society, just like togas. You know, most Romans didn't wear togas any more than they wear tuxedos. They wear tunics brightly coloured, and togas are the posh dress, formal dress. Yeah.
Question over here.
Hi there. In the UK, is there any examples of similar dining? And part two is, having just done Rome in London, what are smaller collections throughout the UK? Because like Newcastle apparently has some nice collections up there. Where else can a visitor go to
and see?
Yeah.
There are in out-of-town villas in Roman Britain, there are assemblages plausibly identified as dining rooms on this style. And I say plausibly because quite often you can see, and this is why dining rooms are quite easy to identify, even when they're pretty ruined, you can see where couches have been fixed. So Lullingston Roman Villa outside London would be a good example of that. Britain doesn't have quite the range of exciting Romano-British sites. I shouldn't say that. I should be very keen on Roman Britain, but you can see I work on Rome, really. But if you're looking for good collections and good sites to visit, then I would recommend the site of Wroxeter, near the Welsh border in Shropshire, where, a bit like as I've kind of hinted, it's often disasters that preserve things. And in Wroxeter, there was a nasty fire in their main marketplace in the 2nd century CE. And you can still see the piles of crockery that had been there waiting to be sold, but were preserved and ruined, but preserved by the flames. I also think that Chedworth Roman Villa in the Cotswolds is very scenic. And, Hadrian's Wall it's always glamorous and romantic. And the site of Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall has produced a lot of, because it's waterlogged, of letters written home by the soldiers on Hadrian's Wall, asking for new pairs of socks and things like that, which is, it's engaging. And Hadrian's Wall is another kind of big question mark because we have no idea really what it was for. Right? I mean, it wouldn't have taken many kind of difficult barbarians more than 5 minutes to get over it, right? So I think we're thinking of something which is it's Hadrian asserting his power by saying, I've built a wall across Britain. Now, what the hell it was for is another matter. It's a bit like some Roman roads. I am going to put a road, right? We don't need a road, but what it does is it asserts the power of Rome, or often the power of the emperor to do that.
Another question over here.
Thank you for coming. Have you considered being a dining reviewer in Chicago?
As long as I don't have to go and review all those restaurants that kind of make a kind of thing about being Roman recreations, very happy to review any other ethnicity. But just like I've never got off on the idea of a toga party and what you have to eat. There is an extraordinary picture of FDR, who celebrated one of his birthdays with a toga party, and he looks so silly, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I know you're expert in Roman upscale dining, but can you make a comparison to Greek upscale dining? Greek.
Yeah. There are differences and similarities. One thing that's very striking about Roman upscale dining is that, by and large, although at Domitian's Black Dinner Party we think there was only men, it's usually men and women. That picture of Livia, Augustus's wife, reclining, Romans were quite unusual in the ancient Mediterranean world in eating with men and women together. So that's one thing that's different. I think that what you see much more in the kind of key bit in Rome, whatever ended up on their plates, is thinking about what they ate. They're not terribly interested in the drink. There are a few kind of good vintages in Roman wine, but basically what the Romans valued was a lot of it, not kind of very posh vintages. And food is central. Certainly in Athens, and it's Athens we know most about, in classical Athens, the key is the drinking party, the symposium, where they drink all men together, and apart from the enslaved women there, who you can imagine what they were for. So it's a focus there on the symposium, drinking together, not eating together. So Rome is really I think, quite special in focusing on food as what brings people together. I think it's very interesting, though, that Romans get about a bit, and they're governing this vast empire, for better or worse, and we have quite a lot of accounts that they give us about the eating habits of the people that they're governing. And Julius Caesar has a bit to say about how weird Roman Britain is. They drink milk and things like that. How awful, But mostly, they just don't seem to notice. And, one of the things that we always kind of imagine there might be is there might be, ethnic restaurants in Rome. There might be should we have a Syrian tonight? No sign of that. So it is quite, it's quite interesting where they don't pick up on difference.
We got one over here.
In your book, you talked about adoption as a means of succession. I'm just curious, did an emperor just say, I adopt so-and-so and he's the emperor, or was it more involved than that?
It's not much more involved. It's just a little bit more involved. One of the things that Rome doesn't ever appear to have is a system of primogeniture, which is in some ways what most Western monarchies have done since. That the firstborn, usually son, not always, will inherit the throne. That is convenient because it stops people fighting it out. There's no question. It's going to be, in our case, Charles or William or whatever. What it lands you with, or it can land you with, is somebody completely hopeless on the throne just because they happen to be the eldest son. So Rome never buys into that system, not even with the succession in property way back. And it's always a kind of matter of choice. To be the son of an emperor helps if you want to succeed. It isn't the only thing. And what you can see going on is the emperor making a decision which is no more than ultimately saying, I am going to adopt Marcellus or whatever. And he then becomes the de facto heir. There's still a question mark, and there's still a question mark about what happens if Marcellus, for example, unfortunately dies or is murdered, right? But it's a relatively informal process, or relatively simple process. But it fits the pattern of Roman adoption throughout. We tend to think that adoption is largely child adoption. Roman adoption is not largely child adoption. It is adoption, even in the big families of the Republic. It's an adoption to ensure some kind of succession. And it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. In the 2nd century, it's elevated to a huge principle of virtue. I am going to choose the best person, by adopting them. The best person out of a, group of 10. But it sounds good.
We got time for 2 more questions. We got one in front. And then...
This has all been very fascinating. One of the things I'd heard about, and you didn't mention, and I'm wondering if it's not a true thing, was the vomitorium.
It's not a true thing. I can happily tell you that. One of the things that we all think we know about really upmarket Roman eating is they went to a room called the vomitorium in order to make themselves sick and then go back and eat more. I could not say that that never happened, right? But I can tell you what a vomitorium is, and it's not a room to go and be sick in. A vomitorium in Latin is the route, the path, or the passageway that leads out of big amphitheatres like the Colosseum. It's where the people spew out of the arena through the vomitorium, right? It's not where you go to think, I can get a little bit more in if I try harder.
So looking back at the stage in Nero's dining room, would emperors perform at their own dinner parties, and what would their guests think of that?
That's a really interesting question. I think that Nero did, and it's terribly, terribly edgy. The whole idea of the emperor performing in public or in private is a real kind of flashpoint in how people think about emperors. And I think it is more interesting than one imagines. Nero, I have no doubt, and I think I could find some references, did perform in private. And the dinner party would be exactly the point to do it, get the lyre and strum. But Nero also notoriously performed in public. He performed in theatres and was apparently so keen that people should watch him that he locked the doors and didn't let them out. And some women gave birth while he was performing, and others pretended to be dead so that they could be stretchered out. And in part, they're they're funny, wonderful stories. And in part, they show Nero as, a capricious guy. He doesn't realise what the position of the emperor is, what they should or shouldn't do. It's also, I think, somewhat deeper. There's more point to it than that, because I think they are asking, what is the difference between an emperor and an actor? Is the emperor in the end just a performer? Does he just play a part? Augustus's last words were supposed to be, give me a clap if I've played my part in the comedy well. And I think that's something that we still worry about. Is the monarch, is the president, are they just play acting? And there was just to finish, there's a wonderful little anecdote which I discovered only last week, actually, about Queen Elizabeth, who one of her last major appearances was in some jubilee or other she had, where she acted in a little play with Paddington Bear that was filmed, went hugely popular, with the Queen inviting Paddington Bear to tea. And one of the people who made that film has just been talking about what it was like making it, and he apparently said, he said to Queen, "Mum, you are a really good actor, And she said, "Are you surprised? It's all I do."